Run away, my son's maid shouted when I came to his place for dinner after 2 years of silence. After 730 days of absolute, deafening silence, my son finally reached out with an invitation to dinner. I walked toward that front door with a heart full of hope, praying for a final reconciliation, but I was walking blindly into a lethal trap. As I stood on the porch of the very estate I had built and eventually gifted to him, the housekeeper suddenly lunged forward, gripped my forearm until it bruised, and hissed, "Do not go inside. Run away right now." I chose to trust the terror in a stranger's eyes. I vanished into the shadows of the garden and watched from the darkness as the life I thought I knew disintegrated before my eyes. The bouquet of deep crimson lilies felt far heavier than it should have as I pulled my modest sedan into the circular driveway of the manor I had signed away 5 years ago. This was my masterpiece, a home I had meticulously designed and overseen down to the last marble tile. The late September sun caught the copper accents of the roof, the glinting windows appearing to mock my foolish optimism. Subscribe to the channel and tell me in the comments where you're listening from. 2 years. That is how long it had been since I had heard Julian's voice. 730 days of cold, empty silence that had been shattered only 3 days prior by a short, cryptic text message. "Dad, can we talk? Dinner at the house Friday, 7 o'clock. Please come. I am 71 years old. I spent nearly 4 decades on the bench, eventually serving as a state Supreme Court justice. I have looked into the eyes of the most cold-blooded killers, the most sophisticated white-collar thieves, and the most silver-tongued liars in the country. I have seen every mask a human being can wear. But when it is your own flesh and blood reaching out after years of nothing, you do not apply the cold, hard logic of the law. You apply hope. And hope, I have learned, can make a fool out of the wisest man. I straightened my silk tie, the silver one Julian had given me for my 65th birthday, back when we were still a family, and stepped toward the entrance. The estate stood in its Heights District glory, a sprawling brick and stone monument currently appraised at over $3,500,000. I had signed the deed over to Julian and his wife, Celeste, as a wedding gift. 5 years ago, I viewed it as an act of legacy and love. Now, I resided in a one-bedroom apartment in the city, but I told myself that was the price of a father's devotion. I was inches from the doorbell when the heavy oak door swung inward. Elena stood there. She had been our housekeeper for over 22 years, staying with us through my wife's long illness and passing, then continuing on for Julian and Celeste. She knew the rhythm of my family better than I did. "Justice Vance," she whispered, her voice a jagged shard of glass. Her fingers clamped around my wrist like a vice. "Do not go in there. You must run. They have prepared something monstrous." I stared at her, my judicial mind struggling to process the raw fear on her face. "Elena, what is happening? Is Julian all right? Please," she urged, her grip tightening until I winced. "You have to trust me. You have to leave this property this second. They are waiting for you, but not for dinner." I had cross-examined thousands of witnesses in my time. You learn to recognize the physiological markers of a lie. The shifting eyes, the unsteady breath, the forced cadence. Elena showed none of these. The panic radiating from her was genuine, primal, and directed entirely at my safety. "Where?" I asked, my voice dropping to a low, authoritative rumble. "The neighbor's laurel hedge," she whispered, pointing toward the edge of the property. "Hide there. Keep your eyes on the front windows. You will see. Please, Justice Vance, for the love of God, go." Something in the sheer desperation of her tone broke through my confusion. I stepped back, the lilies still clutched in my hand, and retreated across the manicured lawn. I moved with a speed my 71-year-old knees hadn't felt in years, tucking myself behind the thick, tall hedges of the neighboring estate. I felt absurd, a former Supreme Court justice crouching in the dirt like a common prowler. But as I waited, my heart hammered against my ribs with a rhythm of impending doom. It only took 6 minutes for the world to turn upside down. 2 black and white police cruisers glided up the driveway, their light bars dancing with silent, predatory flashes of red and blue. Four officers stepped out, their hands resting near their holsters, their faces set in the grim masks of men responding to a violent disturbance. They moved toward the front door with tactical caution. The door opened. Celeste stood there. Even from my vantage point 60 yards away, I could see the performance. She appeared to be hyperventilating, her hands trembling as she clutched at her throat. My judicial instincts, honed over 40 years, scanned her foretells. Her expensive silk blouse was torn at the collar, exposing a shoulder. Her hair, usually a perfect blonde crown, was disheveled. She looked like a woman who had just survived a physical assault. My stomach turned to ice. One of the officers began questioning her, and she gestured wildly toward the interior of the house, then pointed directly toward the foyer where I would have been standing had I entered. She was weeping, or perhaps more accurately, she was painting the image of a victim. The pieces of the puzzle locked together with a sickening metallic click. They had not invited me for dinner. They had invited me for a conviction. This was a choreographed setup. My own son, the boy I had raised with every ounce of my soul, had lured me here to be arrested, to be branded an abuser, and to be discarded. I watched as the officers swept through the house, searching for a dangerous old man who wasn't there. I watched Celeste continue her frantic act, dabbing at her eyes while talking to a sergeant. Then Julian appeared in the doorway. He looked somber, his face a masterpiece of practiced concern and disappointment. My son, the boy I had taught to read, the boy I had coached in Little League, the boy whose hand I held when we buried his mother. He stood there, watching the police hunt for his father, and he didn't say a word to stop it. The lilies fell from my hands, scattering on the damp earth. I couldn't feel my fingers. I couldn't feel the bite of the wind. I felt only a colossal, freezing rage beginning to settle into the marrow of my bones. I waited in that hedge for nearly 40 minutes. I watched the police leave, their expressions confused as they failed to find the attacker. I watched the house lights flicker and settle. Finally, when my body demanded I move or collapse, I crept back to my car, parked a block away, and drove. I do not remember the journey back to my apartment. I do not remember the elevator ride or the sound of my key in the lock. I only remember sitting in my armchair in the dark, staring at the wall of my small living room, a space that could have fit 5 times over inside the grand hall of the house I had gifted away. My son had tried to destroy me. The thought looped in my mind like a transcript from a nightmare. What was the end goal? A torn blouse and a 911 call were just the beginning. They wanted me in a cell. They wanted me discredited. But why? I sat there until the sun began to peek through the blinds. And as the light touched my face, the judge within me woke up. 35 years on the bench teaches you that while justice can be slow, it can also be a sledgehammer. Julian and Celeste thought they were playing a game with a lonely, fading old man. They had forgotten who I was. I was Arthur Vance. I had spent a lifetime dismantling the arguments of the most cunning criminals in the state. I knew the law better than they knew their own names. They wanted to fight. I would give them a trial they would never forget. The game was on, and for the first time in 2 years, the silence was over. I did not sleep that Saturday morning. Instead, I sat in the pale, gray light of my apartment and performed a mental autopsy on my relationship with my son. As a judge, you learn that every crime has a prelude, a series of small, often ignored tremors before the earthquake. I had been willfully blind to the shifting tectonic plates of my own family for 5 years. I reached for my phone, my thumb hovering over Elena's contact name. I waited until exactly 8 o'clock. I knew the household rhythm. Julian would be at his private athletic club, and Celeste would be at her Saturday morning yoga retreat. Elena would be alone, cleaning the remnants of a dinner that was meant to end in my incarceration. When she answered, her voice was a frantic whisper. "Justice Vance? Are you safe? I have been praying all night." "I am safe, Elena. Because of you," I said. My voice regained its gravelly, courtroom authority. "I need you to tell me everything you heard. Do not leave out a single syllable, no matter how much you think it might hurt me." There was a long pause on the other end. I heard the distant hum of a vacuum cleaner, then the click of a door being locked. "They were in the library on Thursday night," she began, her breath hitching. I was polishing the silver in the dining room, and the vents carried their voices perfectly. Mrs. Celeste was laughing. She said, "The restraining order is just the first domino. Once the court sees he's a physical threat to me, he won't be able to contest a single thing we do." My grip on the phone tightened until my knuckles turned white. And Julian? What did my son say? He sounded tired, sir, but he didn't stop her. He asked her if she was sure the police would believe the story. She told him, "Julian, your father is 71. He's lived alone for years. We just have to tell the paramedics." He seemed confused that he lashed out. "With my blouse torn and your testimony, the state will do the rest. We'll have the emergency guardianship signed by a magistrate before he even gets a lawyer." The emergency guardianship. There it was. The motive. They weren't just looking to embarrass me. They were looking to legally erase me. In the state of Texas, an emergency guardianship can strip an individual of their right to control their finances, their residence, and even their right to legal counsel for a temporary period. It is a powerful tool designed to protect the vulnerable, but in the hands of a predator, it is a weapon of total confiscation. "Thank you, Elena," I said quietly. "You have no idea what your courage has done for me. Please stay quiet. Do not let them know we have spoken. Can you do that? For you, Justice Vance, I would do anything. You were the only one who saw me as a person when my own daughter was in the hospital." I haven't forgotten. After we hung up, I leaned back and stared at the ceiling. The $3,500,000 house hadn't been enough for them. They wanted the pension. They wanted the $480,000 in my municipal bond portfolio. They wanted the final remnants of the life I had built with my late wife, Margaret. My mind drifted back to the wedding 5 years ago. It had been the proudest day of my life. Standing in that very garden, watching Julian marry Celeste. She had been a rising star in a boutique wealth management firm, sharp, elegant, and seemingly devoted to my son. "Dad," Julian had said during our private toast, "I promise this house will always be your home. We're just the stewards of the Vance legacy." I had been so moved that I didn't even have the documents reviewed by outside counsel. I trusted my son. I signed the deed over as a gift of love and affection. It was a legal category I had seen abused 100 times in court, yet I walked right into it myself. The decay started almost immediately. 6 months after the honeymoon, the fairness talks began. Celeste was a master of the subtle exclusion. First, it was Thanksgiving. "Arthur, we'd love to have you, but Celeste's parents are flying in from London, and they have such a specific dynamic. We thought we'd do a separate lunch with you the week after." The separate lunch never happened. Then came the renovation requests. "Dad, the plumbing in the East Wing is a disaster," Julian had told me over tense coffee. "The estimate is $65,000. We're a little over-leveraged with the new car and Celeste's firm's buy-in. Could you help?" I wrote the check. Then I wrote another for $40,000 for property tax adjustments. Then another for $25,000 for a landscaping emergency. I was funding the maintenance of a house I no longer owned, while they live a life of champagne and silk. The breaking point, the moment I became an obstacle, happened exactly 2 years ago. They had come to my apartment. Julian looked haunted, but Celeste was radiant, holding a thick leather portfolio. "Arthur," she had said, her voice like warm honey, "we have an opportunity of a lifetime. A private equity play in emerging tech. We need a liquid injection of $500,000. If you move your retirement fund into this vehicle, we could triple your net worth in 36 months." I had spent my life reading fine print. I spent an hour reviewing her projections and saw them for what they were: a high-risk, uncollateralized gamble designed to bail out their own mounting debts. "I can't do it, Julian," I had said firmly. "This isn't an investment. It's a sinkhole, and that money is my only safety net." The transformation in Celeste was instantaneous. The honey in her voice turned to hemlock. "So that's it? You'd rather sit on a pile of cash in this depressing little room than help your son secure his future? You're not being cautious, Arthur. You're being selfish. You're trying to keep Julian under your thumb." "I'm trying to keep us all out of bankruptcy," I countered. Julian hadn't looked at me. He had stared at his shoes while his wife decimated my character. They walked out that day, and the 2 years' silence began. I had reached out dozens of times, voicemails, birthday cards, even a letter on the anniversary of my wife's death. Nothing. Until 3 days ago. The dinner invitation wasn't a white flag. It was a baited hook. They had run out of money. I knew Celeste typed she wouldn't sell the house and move to a smaller one. She would rather commit a felony than admit to her social circle that they were broke. If they couldn't get my money through a gift or an investment, they would take it through a court-ordered guardianship. I stood up and walked to my desk. I pulled out a yellow legal pad and a fresh fountain pen. Sequence of events. I wrote at the top. I spent the next 4 hours documenting every check I had written, every lost holiday, and the exact timeline of the police arriving at the house. I was no longer a grieving father. I was a prosecutor building a case against the two people I had loved most in the world. They thought I was a predictable old man. They thought my age made me a target. But in the world of the law, age isn't just a number, it's a record. I had 40 years of precedents in my head, and I knew exactly which one was going to ruin them. I picked up the phone and dialed a number I hadn't called in a decade. "Silas," I said when the voice answered. "It's Arthur Vance. I need the meanest, most meticulous civil litigator in the city, and I need him by Monday morning." Monday morning arrived with the kind of sharp, cold clarity that usually precedes a major verdict. I sat in the lobby of a skyscraper that housed a firm of Sterling and Associates. Silas had sent me to Marcus Thorne, a man known in legal circles as the Eraser. Marcus didn't just win cases. He dismantled the opposition until there was nothing left but dust and legal fees. When I was ushered into his office, Marcus didn't offer me coffee or small talk. He looked at the yellow legal pad I'd placed on his desk and then looked at me with eyes that were as cold as a winter morning in the Panhandle. "Justice Vance," he said, his voice a low, gravelly baritone. "I spent my first 5 years as a junior associate terrified of appearing in your courtroom. It's an honor to represent you, though I wish it were under better circumstances." "The circumstances are irrelevant, Marcus," I replied, sitting straight-backed in the leather chair. "I am here because my son and his wife attempted to use the very legal system I served for 40 years to commit a kidnapping of my life and my assets. I want them to understand the gravity of that mistake." I spent the next 2 hours laying out the financial forensics I had begun to piece together. I showed him the records of the $130,000 in maintenance checks I had written for a house I didn't live in. I explained the emergency guardianship plot Elena had overheard. Marcus listened with a focused intensity, scribbling notes on a digital tablet. "We have 2 fronts here, Arthur," Marcus said, leaning back. "The first is civil. We're going to file a petition to rescind the deed of the Heights property based on fraudulent inducement and undue influence. In Texas, a gift given under false pretenses or as part of a scheme of exploitation can be voided. We're going to take your house back." He paused, watching for my reaction. I felt a twinge of sadness. That house was meant to be Julian's future, but it was quickly eclipsed by the memory of the police cruisers in the driveway. "And the second front? Criminal," Marcus said firmly. "Attempting to file a false police report is a crime. Conspiracy to commit elder abuse, financial and emotional, is a crime. If we can prove they staged that assault to trigger a guardianship, we aren't just looking at a lawsuit. We're looking at indictments. We need more than my word and Elena's memory," I noted. "As a judge, I wouldn't convict on that alone." Marcus smiled, a predatory expression that made me glad he was on my side. "That is why we're going to use the law of the land. Texas is a one-party consent state for recordings. As long as the person doing the recording is part of the conversation or has been authorized as an agent on the property, we can use it. Since you're filing a claim that the house transfer was fraudulent, we will argue you still maintain a legal interest in the premises. I want you to give Elena a recording device." The next week was a blur of tactical maneuvers. I met with a private investigator named Elias, a former undercover detective who looked like a tired accountant but moved like a cat. He began a discreet surveillance of Julian and Celeste's lifestyle. The findings were staggering. My son and his wife were living a $3 million life on a $50,000 a month deficit. They had 3 maxed-out credit cards with balances exceeding $90,000 each. Celeste had taken out a bridge loan from a predatory lender at an interest rate of 22%. They were drowning, and I was the only life raft they hadn't yet punctured. They're desperate, Arthur, Elias told me during a meeting in a nondescript diner. I followed your son to a meeting with a consultant who specializes in liquidating high-end estates quickly. They aren't just trying to get your pension. They're getting ready to flip the house and run. With me in a facility, I added the reality of it stinging like a lie. Exactly. But here's the clincher. Elias slid a folder across the table. I caught Celeste meeting with a man named Dr. Holloway. He's a psychiatrist whose medical license has been under review twice for highly favorable competency evaluations in probate cases. She's shopping for a doctor to sign off on your dementia. I felt a surge of adrenaline. They were moving faster than I anticipated. I had to strike before they could get a crooked doctor to sign a piece of paper that would strip me of my voice. That evening, I met Elena at a park 2 miles from the house. I handed her a small, high-sensitivity digital recorder disguised as a keychain. Elena, I am asking you to risk your job. If they catch you, they will fire you, and they might even try to sue you. She took the device, her hand steady. They have already fired my soul, Justice Vance. I have watched them treat you like a ghost for 2 years while they spend your hard-earned money on Italian leather and French wine. I am not afraid of them. 3 days later, Elena delivered the recording. I sat with Marcus in his office as we played the file. The audio was crisp. It was the sound of a Tuesday night dinner. The clink of silverware against fine china, the china my wife had picked out in London 30 years ago. We need to do it Friday. Celeste's voice came through, sharp and impatient. Holloway says he'll sign the emergency petition if we can show a history of erratic behavior. That stunt with the police last week was a setback because the old man didn't show up, but we can play it as him stalking the perimeter. We'll say he's hiding in the bushes, watching us. It makes him sound even more unstable. Celeste, he's my father. Julian's voice was weak, muffled. Maybe we just sell the cars? We don't have to go this far. And do what? Move to a condo in the suburbs? I don't think so, Julian. We are 3 weeks away from a foreclosure notice on this mansion. Your father has $750,000 sitting in accounts he's too principled to use. He's 71. He's had his life. It's time he paid for ours. There was a long silence on the tape, followed by the sound of Julian sighing. Fine. What do I need to do? Just sign the affidavit I drafted. State that he came to the door, threatened me, and seemed to have forgotten who I was. That covers both the danger and the incompetence requirements. Marcus hit the stop button. The silence in the office was heavy. He looked at me, and for the first time, I saw a flicker of genuine pity in his eyes. That's it, Arthur, he said softly. That's the smoking gun. It's conspiracy to commit fraud, perjury, and elder abuse. We have them. I stood up and walked to the window, looking out at the city I had served for so long. I felt an incredible weight on my chest. My son had just traded my life for a house and a reputation. File the papers, Marcus, I said, my voice cold and final. File everything. The petition for the house, the civil suit for the return of the maintenance funds, and the criminal referral to the district attorney. I want them served by the sheriff's department. I don't want a private process server. I want them to see the badge. It will be public, Arthur. The Vance name will be in the headlines. The Vance name was already dragged through the mud the moment they invited me to a fake dinner to have me arrested. I replied. Now, the Vance name is going to stand for something else, justice. I left the office and walked toward the courthouse. I didn't go inside. I just stood on the steps, watching the people go by. I thought about Julian as a little boy, terrified of the dark, and how I had promised him I would always protect him. I was still protecting him, in a way. I was protecting him from becoming the kind of person who could get away with destroying his own father. It was a hard lesson, the kind I used to deliver from the bench. The lesson was simple. In this life, you don't get to choose your consequences. You only get to choose your actions. And Julian had made his choice. The following Monday was a day of reckoning. I didn't want to be a spectator to the destruction of my family. But as a judge, I knew that the presence of the complainant is sometimes the only thing that prevents a liar from spinning a new web. I sat in Marcus's black SUV, parked a discreet distance down the street from the Heights estate. At exactly 10 o'clock in the morning, two marked sheriff's vehicles pulled into the circular driveway. This wasn't a quiet delivery of papers. This was the high-impact service Marcus had requested. For deputies stepped out. Their presence was a physical manifestation of the law they had tried to subvert. I watched through the tinted glass as the front door, the same door where Elena had saved me, opened. Julian appeared first, dressed in a bathrobe, looking disoriented. Then Celeste stepped out behind him, her face already hardening into a mask of indignant fury. I could almost hear her rehearsing the "Do you know who we are?" speech. One of the deputies handed Julian a thick stack of legal documents. Even from the street, I saw the moment his knees buckled. He didn't just receive a lawsuit. He received a 300-page autopsy of his own greed. The civil petition to void the deed, the temporary restraining order freezing their bank accounts, and the notice of a criminal investigation into the attempted filing of a false police report. Celeste snatched the papers from Julian's trembling hands. She began screaming at the deputies, her composure disintegrating into the raw, ugly vibration of a cornered animal. Deputies, professionals to the end, simply pointed to the signature line on their tablets and walked back to their cruisers. "It's done, Arthur," Marcus said from the driver's seat. "The court has granted the ex parte order. As of this moment, they cannot sell a single brick of that house, and their liquid assets are under the supervision of a court-appointed receiver." "What about the criminal side?" I asked, my eyes fixed on my son, who was now sitting on the porch steps with his head in his hands. "The district attorney's office received the recordings this morning," Marcus replied. "They're assigning it to the Elder Abuse Task Force. Detective Sarah Jenkins will be calling you for a formal statement by the end of the day." 48 hours later, the counterattack began. Just as Marcus predicted, Celeste didn't go quietly. She hired a reputation management firm and a high-priced defense attorney who immediately went to the local news. The headline on the evening broadcast made my stomach churn. "Former Justice Arthur Vance accused of using judicial influence to bully grieving son." They played an interview with Celeste. She looked tired, wearing a modest sweater, her hair pulled back, a complete reversal of the high-fashion predator I knew. "Arthur hasn't been himself since Margaret passed," she told the reporter, her voice trembling with practiced emotion. "He's become paranoid, aggressive. He showed up at our house, shouting, threatening Julian. We only called the police because we were afraid for his safety. We were trying to get him help, and now he's using his old friends in the courthouse to take our home away. It's heartbreaking." The phone in my apartment began to ring incessantly. Former colleagues, old friends, even the clerk of the court, all calling to ask if the rumors were true. Was I losing my mind? Was I really suing my only son out of spite? "Let them talk, Arthur," Marcus told me when I went to his office, feeling the weight of the public shame. The louder they scream now, the harder they fall in the deposition. "We have the audio." They don't know we have the audio. The deposition was scheduled for Thursday. Under the law, a deposition is a formal session where witnesses must answer questions under oath before trial. It is the place where lies go to die. We met in a sterile conference room on the 40th floor. Julian and Celeste sat across from us, flanked by 3 attorneys. Celeste wouldn't look at me. She spent the entire time whispering to her lead counsel, a man named Sterling who had a reputation for being a shark. Julian, however, looked like a ghost. He was pale, his eyes bloodshot, his hands hidden beneath the table to conceal their shaking. Marcus started with Celeste. He was patient, almost gentle, luring her into a sense of security. "Mrs. Vance," Marcus began, "you claim that on the night of March 15th, Arthur Vance appeared at your door in a state of psychotic agitation. Is that correct?" "Yes," she said, her voice clear and firm. "He was screaming about money. He threatened to destroy us if we didn't return the house. I was terrified for my life." "And you called the police because of this immediate threat?" "Absolutely. I had no choice." "And Julian," Marcus turned his gaze to my son, "you saw this? You witnessed your father threatening your wife." Julian hesitated. He looked at Celeste. She squeezed his arm, the same possessive grip I had seen a dozen times. "Yes," Julian whispered. "Hey, He wasn't himself. Marcus nodded slowly, then reached into his briefcase and pulled out a small digital speaker. That's very interesting testimony, because we have the dispatch logs from the police department. The 911 call was placed at 6:42 p.m. However, the neighbor's security camera shows Arthur Vance's car didn't even enter the neighborhood until 6:51 p.m. How did you report an assault that hadn't happened yet, Celeste? The silence in the room was so thick it felt like it had weight. Celeste's lawyer stood up. This is an ambush. My client might have been mistaken about the exact timing due to the trauma. Mistaken about the time? Marcus smiled, and it was the coldest thing I'd ever seen. Or perhaps she was just following the script she discussed the night before. Let's listen, shall we? He hit the play button. The room was filled with Celeste's voice from the Tuesday night recording. The restraining order is just the first domino. We'll have the emergency guardianship signed. The old man won't be able to contest a single thing we do. As the recording played, the color drained from Sterling's face. He looked at his client, then at the recording device, then at me. He knew the game was over, but it was Julian's reaction that broke me. He let out a low, whimpering sound and put his face in his hands. I told you, he sobbed, his voice muffled. I told you he'd know. I told you we couldn't do this to him. Shut up, Julian, Celeste hissed, her mask finally slipping. She turned to Marcus, her eyes burning with a terrifying, sociopathic rage. That recording is illegal. It's a violation of privacy. We'll sue you for everything you have. It was recorded by an authorized agent on the property with the consent of the legal owner who is currently challenging a fraudulent deed, Marcus said coolly. It is perfectly admissible. And it's not just civil, Celeste. The assistant district attorney is standing in the hallway right now. They've seen enough. The door to the conference room opened. Two detectives stepped in. They didn't go for Celeste first. They went for Julian. Julian Vance, you're under arrest for conspiracy to commit fraud and filing a false police report. As the handcuffs clicked into place over my son's wrists, he finally looked at me. For a fleeting second, I didn't see the greedy man who had tried to steal my life. I saw the 8-year-old boy who had fallen off his bike, looking to me to fix the pain. But I couldn't fix this. I had spent 40 years teaching that actions have consequences. If I stepped in now, if I used my influence to save him from the results of his own choices, I would be betraying everything I had ever stood for. Dad, he choked out as they led him away. Dad, please. I didn't speak. I couldn't. I just sat there, a 71-year-old man in a tailored suit, feeling the hollow victory of justice. Celeste was next. She didn't cry. She didn't beg. She walked out between the detectives with her head held high, still trying to project an image of superiority even as the steel bracelets locked around her wrists. When the room was finally empty, save for Marcus and me, I felt the silence return. But it wasn't the silence of the last 2 years. This was the silence of a finished trial. We'll get the house back, Arthur, Marcus said, placing a hand on my shoulder. The court will void the deed by the end of the month. You can move back in by the holidays. The house is just bricks and mortar. Marcus, I said, my voice sounding older than I felt. I spent my life defending the law because I believed it protected the innocent. I just never realized the person I need protection from most was the one I gave life to. I stood up and walked to the window. Down below, I saw the police cars pulling away. I had won. I had my money, I had my reputation, and I would soon have my house. But as I looked at the empty chair where my son had just been sitting, I realized that in the court of the heart, there are no winners. The legal system moves with a cold, rhythmic precision once the gears of truth are finally engaged. Over the next 6 months, the Grand Manor in the Heights district transformed from a crime scene into a courtroom exhibit, and finally, back into a home. The Vance versus Vance case became a landmark study in the state for the prosecution of elder financial exploitation. The trial was not the grand, televised spectacle Celeste had hoped for. Instead, it was a quiet, devastating presentation of facts. My financial analyst presented a paper trail that looked like a map of a sinking ship. Every loan, every maxed-out credit card, and every dollar of mine that had been diverted to pay for Celeste's designer wardrobe and Julian's country club memberships. Then came the audio. When the judge heard my son's voice agreeing to have me declared incompetent while his wife laughed about predictable old men, the atmosphere in the room changed. It wasn't just about money anymore. It was about the desecration of the sacred bond between parent and child. The final judgment was absolute. The deed to the Heights estate was voided on the grounds of fraudulent inducement and undue influence. The gift of love and affection was legally struck from the record, as the court found neither love nor affection had been present in the hearts of the recipients. Furthermore, Julian and Celeste were ordered to pay restitution in the amount of $495,000, the total sum of the maintenance funds and investments they had manipulated out of me over the years. But the criminal consequences were what truly finalized the story. Julian, facing 10 years for his role in the conspiracy, took a plea deal. He testified against Celeste in exchange for a suspended sentence and 5 years of intensive probation. The paper felt heavy in my hand, the texture of the official stationery a stark contrast to the thick, cream-colored invitations Julian used to send out for his lavish galas. I traced the embossed seal of the probation office, my thumb lingering over the word amends. It is a heavy word, one that implies a debt can be calculated, appraised, and repaid in installments. But how do you calculate the cost of a stolen decade? How do you put a price on the moment a son looks at his father and sees nothing but a bank account to be drained? I walked to the window of the library, the letter tucked into my pocket. Outside, the rain was a relentless gray curtain, blurring the sharp edges of the Heights district. I watched Elena in the garden, clad in a yellow slicker, stubborn against the elements as she staked the young saplings we had planted together. She moved with a quiet, deliberate grace. A woman who had lost her own family to the whims of history and yet remained anchored to the earth. She was the one who had stayed when the emerald liquid was being poured. She was the one who had scrubbed the stains from the carpet while I was in exile. I thought of Julian in that warehouse. I pictured his soft, manicured hands that had once held crystal flutes of vintage champagne, now gripping cardboard boxes and cold steel. I wondered if the hunger he spoke of still clawed at his insides, or if the cold reality of a concrete floor had finally silenced the noise. The impulse to go to him was a physical ache, a phantom limb of fatherhood that refused to believe the body was mutilated. I wanted to see the boy who had slid down the banister, the one whose laughter once made this tomb feel like a home. But as I reached for my coat, my gaze fell upon the digital forensic reports Victor had compiled, the Project Green files that still sat in a neat folder on my desk. I remembered the systematic siphoning, the calculated way he had watched me grow frail, and the scream he had let out not for my health, but for the fear that his supply of control was being threatened. To go to him now, without a true reckoning, would not be an act of love. It would be an act of cowardice. It would be the judge allowing a mistrial because he liked the defendant. I sat back down in my leather chair, the springs creaking like a long-forgotten grievance. Justice, I realized, is not just about what happens in a courtroom with a gavel and a robe. It is about the boundaries we set in the quiet of our own hearts. Julian wanted to make amends, but the letter didn't speak of the victims Celeste had defrauded. It didn't speak of the elderly people whose lives were gutted while they traded on the Thorn name. It spoke of his need for peace, his need for my validation. It was still, in its own way, an act of consumption. The following morning, I invited Marcus Thorn over. He arrived with his usual efficiency, a leather briefcase clicking shut as he sat across from me. He didn't ask about the letter, but I knew he had seen the postmark on the hall table. "He wants a meeting, Marcus," I said, my voice steady despite the tremor in my chest. Marcus looked at me with the eyes of a man who had seen 1,000 families tear themselves apart over a few decimal points. "And what does Arthur Vance want?" "I want the truth," I replied. "But I don't think he has it in him to give it to me. He spent too long living in the fiction Celeste authored for him." "Then don't go as a father," Marcus suggested, his voice softening. "Go as a man who is looking for a closing statement. You've spent your life finishing cases, Arthur. This is the one you left open." I took his advice, but I didn't go to the halfway house. I sent a car for him and arranged for us to meet in a neutral space, a small, sterile park near the waterfront, far from the shadows of the mansion and the weight of the heights. When Julian stepped out of the car, I barely recognized him. The tailored suits were gone, replaced by a cheap, ill-fitting jacket and work boots. He had lost weight, his face drawn tight over his cheekbones, his eyes shadowed with a fatigue that no amount of sleep could fix. He looked at me, and for a second, I saw the flicker of the old Julian, the charm, the practiced tilt of the head. But it died quickly when he saw my expression. I wasn't there to be the benefactor. I was there as the bench. We sat on a cold iron bench, the sound of the river rushing past us, a constant, churning reminder of time's passage. "Father," he started, his voice cracking. I don't know where to begin." "Begin with the money, Julian," I said, my voice devoid of the warmth he was fishing for. "Not mine, the others. The families Celeste ruined while you watched. Tell me you've contacted them. Tell me you've offered to work the rest of your life to pay back what you helped her steal." He looked down at his hands, those rough, warehouse-worn hands. "I can't pay them back, Dad. Not with what I make. It would take 100 years. Then you start the first year today," I said. "Amends aren't about how much you return, Julian. They are about the acknowledgement that you are not the center of the tragedy. You and Celeste thought you were the protagonists of a grand drama. You weren't. You were just thieves." He began to cry then, not the guttural moan of agony I had heard in the library, but a quiet, pathetic weeping. He spoke of the hunger, of how Celeste had made him feel powerful, of how the green liquid had made the world feel soft and manageable. He tried to explain the noise, the constant, ringing pressure of living up to a legacy he felt he could never inherit. I listened until he was empty, until the sun began to dip below the horizon, casting the same golden shadows I now watched from my study. When he was finished, I didn't hug him. I didn't tell him it was okay. I stood up and straightened my coat. "I have set up a trust," I told him, and his eyes widened with a spark of the old greed. I crushed it instantly. "It is not for you. It is a restitution fund for the families on Victor's list. Every cent of the inheritance you thought you were protecting is going there. Your amends will be to act as the administrator of that fund under Marcus's supervision. You will face those people, Julian. You will hear their stories. You will sign the checks that return their dignity. That is the only way you ever set foot in my house again." He looked at me with a mixture of horror and realization. The easy path was gone. The gift of health had been replaced by the bitter medicine of reality. "I'll do it," he whispered. "I know you will," I said, "because you have nothing else left." I walked away from him then, leaving him on that bench by the river. As I drove back to the mansion, the rain finally stopped, leaving the world shimmering and clean. I walked through my foyer, past the dark banister, and into the library where Elena had left a fresh pot of tea. The house is quiet now, but it is a restorative quiet. I am 71 years old, and I have finally learned that the most difficult verdict to deliver is the one you have to live with every day. My son is not my legacy. My integrity is. I sit in my chair, the roses outside blooming in the moonlight, and for the first time in 40 years, I don't feel like a judge. I feel like a man who is finally, truly home. The shadows of the late afternoon stretch across my study, touching the leather-bound volumes of case law that represent 50 years of a life built on the bedrock of the great equalizer. People often ask me if I regret the coldness of that final sentence I sent to Julian. They look at my solitary existence in this cavernous mansion and see a tragedy of isolation. They see a father who chose the letter of the law over the blood in his veins. But they do not see the weight of the emerald liquid that once stained my floor. They do not understand that some gifts are merely gilded cages, and some love is actually a slow-acting poison. My mornings begin with the rhythmic clipping of Elena's shears in the garden below. She is a woman of few words now, her spirit having been tempered by the fires Julian set with his desperation. We exist in a state of mutual, unspoken understanding. She tends to the roses, those vibrant, blood-red blooms that replace the lilies of my near demise, and I tend to the remnants of my conscience. We are the survivors of a domestic war, two veterans who found peace only after the surrender of the man we both tried to save. Julian's letters still arrive occasionally, postmarked from the facility where he serves his time and attempts to reconcile with his hunger. I did not open them. To do so would be to reopen a wound that has finally begun to scar over. I know what they contain. The same frantic justifications, the same hollow apologies, and the same manipulative pleas for a grace he never earned. Forgiveness is a divine concept, but accountability is a human necessity. If I were to provide him an easy out, I would be betraying every principle I ever upheld from the bench. I would be telling the world that the law stops at the front door of the wealthy and the beloved. Instead, I focus my remaining strength on the pro bono work. There is a particular irony in an old man who was nearly swindled by his own son, helping others navigate the predatory waters of elder law. When I sit across from a widow whose daughter is trying to seize her estate, or a grandfather being coerced into signing away his dignity, I see myself in their frightened, watering eyes. I offer them more than just legal counsel. I offer them the permission to be angry. I tell them that it is not a sin to protect the life you labor to build. The Heights District is quiet tonight, the kind of quiet that feels earned rather than forced. I remember the polite silence of the years before, the tiptoeing around Julian's moods, the muffled arguments, the creeping dread that something was fundamentally broken in the foundation of our family. That silence was a lie. The silence I enjoy now is a truth. It is the sound of a house that no longer hides secrets in its floorboards or toxins in its glasses. As the light fades, I pour myself a glass of water, clear, pure, and honest. I look at my reflection in the window, a 71-year-old man who is neither a victim nor a villain. I am simply a man who refused to let his legacy be rewritten by another's greed. The verdict is final, the court is adjourned, and for the first time in a decade, the judge is finally at rest. Victor's office smelled of ozone and stale coffee, a stark contrast to the scent of cedar and old paper in my own library. It was here that the image of Celeste, the polished, grieving socialite she played for the cameras, began to disintegrate into a series of cold, mathematical betrayals. Watching those transfers felt like watching a predator mark its territory. Each transaction was a calculated strike against a vulnerable target. An estate left to a minor, a pension fund for a retired teacher, the life savings of a man who had trusted her with his legacy because she carried the prestigious Thorn name. She used your reputation as a shield, Arthur, Marcus said, leaning against the doorframe, his shadow long and sharp against the illuminated data. People didn't ask questions because they thought a judge's daughter-in-law was above reproach. She traded on your honor to bankrupt the helpless. The realization settled in my gut like lead. It wasn't just Julian's weakness or a momentary lapse in judgment. They had turned my very life's work into a weapon for their larceny. Victor scrolled further, revealing a hidden directory titled Project Green. It contained the chemical blueprints for the very health tonic that had stained my shirt. It wasn't a supplement. It was a cocktail of highly addictive sedatives and synthetic stimulants designed to create a state of chemical dependency. They weren't just trying to take your money, Victor whispered, his voice tinged with a rare note of disgust. They were trying to ensure you were never lucid enough to stop them. They were building a cage made of emerald liquid and digital debt. I looked at the screen, at the cold reality of their malice, and felt the last vestiges of fatherly hesitation wither away. This was no longer a family dispute. It was a criminal enterprise that happened to share my dinner table. Every line of code was a piece of evidence, every transfer a nail in the coffin of their freedom. I realized then that the tactical warfare Marcus spoke of would not end with a settlement. It would end with total destruction. I wasn't just fighting for my estate anymore. I was fighting to excise a cancer that had grown in the dark under my own roof. She was using your gifts and loans to pay back other investors she defrauded. The realization hit me like a physical blow. My son hadn't just married a spendthrift. He had married a predator who used our family name as a cloak for her crimes. If we can link this to the guardianship plot, I said, my voice cold, we don't just have a civil case for the house. We have a federal racketeering charge. We're getting there, Victor replied. But look at Julian's private messages. This is where it gets heavy. He opened a file containing archived messages between my son and Celeste from the months leading up to the dinner trap. I read them with a heavy heart. Julian wasn't a mastermind. He was a hostage of his own weakness. Celeste, my dad is suspicious. He's asking about the property tax receipts. We can't keep doing this, Julian had written in June. Celeste's reply was chilling. Then make him stop asking. If he's so confused about the taxes, maybe it's time we document that confusion. One more month, Julian. Just get him to the house. Reading those words in black and white was different than hearing them on a recording. It was the architecture of a betrayal built brick by brick. They had discussed my confusion as a commodity, a tool to be traded for their continued luxury. While Victor handled the digital side, Elias, my private investigator, was busy on the ground. He had discovered that Celeste was frequenting a high-stakes, underground gambling ring in the city's industrial district. This was where the $3,500,000 lifestyle was truly disappearing. She's a degenerate gambler, Arthur, Elias told me as we sat in my car, watching the house from distance. She's not just buying shoes. She's betting $50,000 on a single hand of blackjack. Your son is sitting at home, probably staring at the walls, while she's out burning through the Vance legacy in windowless basements. I looked at my house standing silent in the moonlight. I thought about the thousands of hours I had worked, the difficult decisions I had made from the bench, all to provide a foundation for a son who was now watching a woman gamble it all away. We need to push the pressure, I decided. Marcus said they're trying to delay the deposition. I want to move it up. I want them in that room before she can lose any more of the assets we're trying to recover. The psychological pressure began to take its toll on Julian first. Elias reported that Julian had stopped going to the office. He was seen pacing the perimeter of the estate at 3 in the morning, sometimes talking to himself. The guilt was a parasite, eating him from the inside out. One evening, my phone rang. It was an unknown number. I answered, and for a long time, there was only the sound of heavy, ragged breathing. Dad, it was Julian. His voice was cracked, barely recognizable. I am here, Julian, I said, my voice devoid of emotion. I knew Marcus would tell me to hang up, but the father in me couldn't. I'm sorry. She said it would be okay. She said you wouldn't even know where you were. She said you'd be happy in a place with a garden and people to take care of you. I didn't want to hurt you. You didn't want to hurt me? I repeated, the words tasting like ash. You invited me to a house you stole, to have me arrested by officers I might have worked with, to have me locked in a ward so you could pay off a gambler's debts. Which part of that wasn't meant to hurt, Julian? I can't do this anymore, Dad. Please, just make it stop. There is only one way to make it stop, Julian. Tell the truth. Not to me, to the district attorney. Turn yourself in before Celeste takes you down with her. There was a sob, and then the line went dead. I sat in the dark for a long time after that. I knew then that the end was near. The Vance versus Vance saga was moving toward its final act. The trap they had set for me had snapped shut on them instead, and all that was left was to count the casualties. I called Marcus. He called me. He's breaking. Good, Marcus replied. I'll contact the DA. We'll offer him a proffer chance to tell his story before the handcuffs come out. If he moves now, he might stay out of cage. But Celeste? She's going to fight until the last cent is gone. Let her fight, I said. I've spent 40 years in a row watching people like her. They always think they're the smartest person in the room until the jury comes back. I'll see you at the courthouse.